Hello. In this video, we'll be talking about the sale of a receivable with and without recourse. We are discussing about the financing with receivables. In a previous video, we discussed financing with receivables, how to do that through secured borrowing. In this video, we'll be talking about when we actually sell receivables as a way of financing transactions. As a quick recap, when companies need cash, one way they can get that cash is through financing their receivables. And what they do, it can vary, but companies have either accounts receivables or notes receivables on their financial statements, and they can use those receivables and either sell them or they can do what's called a secured borrowing, which is discussed in a previous video. But we're going to talk about the sales of receivables. And so a company will sell the receivable to a buyer, right? And someone else will buy those receivables and they will have ownership of those receivables. And in turn, the buyer gives the seller money, but it will give them something less than what the receivable is for. And it's usually sold at a loss. There's two types of sales of receivables that we're going to be talking about. There's with recourse and without recourse. But first, we're going to talk about the without recourse. Some terms you should know is factors are the companies or banks that buy the receivables for a fee and then collect the payments directly from the customers. So if I, like me, I sell to a factor my receivables, I have $100,000 worth of receivables on my books, I will sell the factor, which is the buyer, my receivable, for example, for $90,000. And then the factor is responsible for collecting that $100,000 of receivables. So, like I said, the sale can be done, arranged in one of two ways, with and without recourse. Factoring arrangement, which means a selling arrangement, the selling of the receivable, is made without recourse. When it's made without recourse, it means that the buyer cannot ask the seller for more money if the receivables prove to be uncollectible. So the buyer assumes all the risk. So if those receivables that they purchased are uncollectible, it's their loss. So they have more risk in a sale without recourse. Let's take a look at a couple of examples when we have sales without recourse. So the buyer has more risk. EBC Inc. will sell $500,000 of accounts receivable to Blue Line on a without recourse basis. Here are some facts. Blue Line assesses a finance charge of 3% of the face amount of the accounts receivable, which is $500,000, and they will retain an amount equal to 5% of the accounts receivable in case they can't collect on it. So the way these transactions work is here, Blue Line is the buyer. They're the factor of the receivable. They're the buyer. And this is how they make their money. They charge a finance charge, in this example, of 3% of the $500,000, right? Because they're doing all the work collecting the money from the customers. And plus, they also retain, so they withhold an amount equal to 5% for any sort of returns for allowances or discounts or uncollectible, right? Accounts receivable will not necessarily be 100% collectible. So they pretty much know that they're not going to be able to collect the full $500,000. They're going to be able to collect something less than that. And they estimate that's going to be 5%. So they're going to withhold that 5%. And if it turns out that they were able to collect, let's just say, the full $500,000, then they will remit the 5% back to the seller, back to EBC Inc. So how should this be recorded? Let's look at it from the seller side, and then we'll look at it from the buyer side. So the seller is EBC, and so they're selling their accounts receivable. So the first part of my entry that I want to do is I want to credit my $500,000 because I'm selling that to Blue Line. And then you record what's called a loss on sale of receivables. And this is the finance. Basically, this is the finance charge, if you will. This is how the buyer makes their money for the 3%. And we're going to call it loss on sale of receivables. So we already know for sure we're not going to collect that $15,000 because we're paying it out. Well, we're getting less cash for our accounts receivable by that amount. Additionally, we record a receivable from factor, so from this buyer, so which is Blue Line, for 5% of $500,000. And we record a receivable for that because if the buyer actually collects that money, then they will remit it back to us. And then the rest of it is just cash, right, to make your entry balance. So the seller receives essentially $500,000 cash, plus they have a receivable for $25,000. So they have the received assets worth $485,000, and they gave away assets worth $500,000. The buyer, Blue Line, now has an accounts receivable in their books for $500,000. They paid the seller, right? They paid Blue Line. They paid EBC $460,000. This $15,000 is that 3% finance charge, which they call interest revenue. And they also credit due to customer, meaning to EBC, it's a liability, because if they collect on that, if they collect that $25,000 as part of their accounts receivable, then they will owe it to EBC. They have to remit it, and that's equivalent to what EBC recorded as a receivable. Just another quick example with slightly different facts that I want to go through. And in this situation, we have Santa Teresa transferred accounts receivable that had a book value of $600,000, and it tells us it's without recourse. And the factor, which is the buyer, right, immediately remitted to Santa Teresa cash equal to 90% of the factored amount, which is $540,000. So Santa Teresa received $500,000 in cash, and they sold $600,000 worth of receivables to the factor. Now, here's where the facts kind of change from the previous example. The factor, the buyer, retains the remaining 10%, right? Because they only gave them 90%. So the remaining 10% is used to cover its factoring fee, or finance fee as I called it before, which is 4% of the total. So that's $24,000. This is how they make their money. And the rest of it is to provide a cushion against any potential returns and allowances in uncollectible receivables. After factor has collected cash equal to the amount advanced to Santa Teresa plus the factoring fee, factor will remit the excess to Santa Teresa. So basically what this is just saying, after the buyer, right, of those receivables collects the cash, they're going to remit the remaining amount less the factoring fee that they get to keep to Santa Teresa. So therefore, Santa Teresa has a, quote, beneficial interest in the transferred receivables. So Santa Teresa has a receivable equal to the fair value of the last 10% of the receivables less the 4% factoring fee. So let's just ignore this part right here, which was 50 grand, for a second. Basically, Santa Teresa, right, they received 540,000 and sold 600,000. They received $540,000 of cash, sold $600,000 of accounts receivable. The factoring fee that the buyer is charging is 4%. And so then in theory, the remaining 6% that the factor retains is to account for any uncollectible receivables or any sales returns and allowances, which would be $36,000. However, and so then the Santa Teresa would record a receivable normally for that $36,000. However, in this example, it tells us that that last 10% of receivables to be collected, the management estimates it to be 50,000. So they don't actually estimate the accounts receivable that they're going to collect to be 60,000. They think it's going to be 50,000. So right, so if the difference between the 600 and 540,000 is 60,000, but the management thinks, no, we're not going to collect 60,000. We're going to collect 50,000, and within that 50,000, we're going to keep our 4% factoring fee because that's how we make our money. So let's look at this journal entry, and this journal entry is for what is this called? Santa Teresa. This is for the seller, this journal entry. So the seller, right, we said they sold their accounts receivable at book value, so we're going to credit accounts receivable. We received cash for $540,000, and then here our receivable from the factor is going to be 50,000 because they believe the buyer believes that they're only going to be able to collect 50,000 of those accounts receivable past the 90%, minus they have a fee of 24,000, which leaves us with 26,000. So the receivable that we might get from the buyer is 26,000, and this loss on the sale of receivable, right, because we will never collect that, is plug. So it's just a little different because in the previous example, we would have taken the 60,000 minus 24,000, right, the full 10% difference. But here management believes it's not the full 10% difference. They're only going to be able to collect 50,000. So let's talk about sale with recourse. When a company sells their accounts receivable with recourse, then the seller retains all the risk of bad debt, which means that the seller pretty much guarantees to the buyer that for whatever amount that you as the buyer do not collect on that receivable, the seller, will pay it back to you. And so that's the big difference. And the way the seller records that is they record a liability for the amount that they are guaranteeing, if you will, as the amount that they'll pay back to the buyer. Usually a seller, because the seller is retaining a higher risk than without recourse, the buyer will usually charge a lower factoring fee. However, sometimes they'll charge the same factoring fee, but they will only enter into a sale with recourse because it gives them an additional guarantee of collecting their money. So let's take this example, and I crossed out some parts that we don't need, but your company EBC will sell $500,000 of accounts receivable to Blue Line on a with recourse basis. The Blue Line assesses a finance charge of 3% of the face amount of the accounts receivable. So this is the way they make their money. And then it doesn't say it in these details, but just like the previous example, they also charge a 3% of finance plus the 5% that they withhold for for sales returns or uncollectibles. So we get the cash that we actually get is actually 92% of the face value, which is the $500,000 minus the 8% of the 3 plus 5. But so it's possible that we will get back as the seller the full 5% if the buyer is able to collect 100% on those receivables. But you as the seller determine that we think as a seller that $6,000 of that receivable will truly be uncollectible, and we will owe that to the buyer because it's with recourse, and we will record a recourse liability for $6,000. So let's look at the journal entries that we have here. We received cash for $460,000, and that is the equal to the $500,000 times 92%, right? Because the buyer kept 3% as their finance charge, which is that $15,000, plus they withheld 5% for what they deem to be might be uncollectible. But if it is collectible, then the buyer will remit it back to us, the seller, which is why we record a receivable for that. So we get the cash of $500,000 and 92%, but here we record a receivable for the $500,000 times 5%. So in total, that gives us an asset of $500,000 times at 97%, which means that makes sense because it's only the finance charge that they charge us is 3%. So here we have like a net book value of $485,000 so far. However, this is a with recourse situation. I'm just going to erase this just so it's not as messy. But so we think, okay, our asset, we don't actually think we're gonna, our assets should be $485,000 because we as the seller, EBC, thinks that $6,000 of that receivable will truly be uncollectible. So we're gonna reduce our assets, if you will, by that $6,000. So our net proceeds that we expect will be $479,000. So here, let's just go back down to the journal entry for EBC, which is the seller. We received cash for $460,000. We sold our receivables. The book value of the receivable is $500,000. We record a liability for this recourse for the amount that we truly feel will be uncollectible for $6,000. We credit $6,000. And then we still have the receivable from Blue Line for $25,000 in case they are able to collect, the full amount on that receivable or a portion of it. Then they will remit that back to us. So we record that as a receivable. And then the plug really is this loss on sale of receivable is $21,000. Now we're going to go to our second example that we did with the without recourse, and it's for the Santa Teresa that they sold the receivable to the factor, but now the with recourse, they estimate that the fair value of the recourse obligation will be $5,000. So in this situation, they think that they will not be able to collect $5,000 as the buyer of the receivables will not be able to collect $5,000, and therefore the seller will be responsible for that amount. Let me just quickly, so I just want to quickly go back to this example right here, that original example that we did with the without recourse, and that is that the factor, right, we sold $600,000 of accounts receivable, but the buyer withheld 10%, right? So they gave us 90% in cash, and they withheld 10%, and they said 4% is for the fee, right? That's the finance charge, and but they feel like $50,000 of it might, and they feel that the remaining, like out of that 10% and minus the 24,000 fee, they will only be able to collect $50,000 of it, not the full 60, right? If you take the full 10% to account. So that's what we did here when we did without recourse. So now with recourse, the seller is giving the buyer this basically saying that we think that potentially $5,000 will actually not be collectible, and if it's not, then the seller will pay that to the buyer. So it's the same facts where the cash is we got $540,000 cash and we sold $600,000 of our accounts receivable, right? And we still have a receivable from the factor for what they think will actually be collectible is $50,000 less their fee of $24,000. So we still have this receivable of $26,000. But now we are recording this liability because it's basically we're guaranteeing that that receivable will be collectible, whether it's that the buyer will be able to collect on those receivables, whether it be from the customers or from us. And us being the seller, so we will book a $5,000 liability for that. And then here we have our plug, and this is our loss on the sale of the receivables. So, right, that's just our plug.